Godson, Director, Policy Exchange. Pleasure to be your host today. Two obviously leading figures in national debate on policing, Commissioner of Metropolis Police, and Sir Trevor Philips, Senior Fellow at Policy Exchange, and obviously first Chairman of the Greater London Authority, and after that obviously Chair of the Equality Commission. Both men been significant to our work here at Policy Exchange as members previously of Policy Exchange's, the advisory panel of Policy Exchange's Livable London work stream, the importance of which needs no enumeration today. The Commissioner will start off with some opening remarks and then move over to an in-conversation with Sir Trevor, and then he'll turn it over to the audience here for what I know will be a vigorous discussion. Unusual House rule, no question too outrageous. You simply have to state your name and organisation first. Particularly appropriate to have Commissioner here, of course, today, as tomorrow is the first anniversary of his becoming Commissioner, and it's obviously one of the most important periods in the history of policing in this country, and I know that many of you will have many things to say. Commissioner, thank you for coming. Thank you for your friendship through the years. Look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Mind the step, as they say. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm just going to sort of open up for 7 to 10 minutes and give some reflections on the challenges I see in policing at the moment, the progress we've been making on the long journey we've got to go ahead. But I want to finish on a proposition that we need to let the police police. There are too many issues that are drawing police away from their core functions, too much bureaucracy that's making it too difficult, and oversight of the tens of thousands of good officers that makes it harder for them to confront the difficult, dangerous criminals that they encounter. So, first thing though, it's a humbling responsibility to be Commissioner, largely because of what I see tens of thousands of great men and women doing every day, and the expectations, the rightly high expectations we see from communities. It's been an interesting first year, many exceptional events, not least just the last few days where I've seen the whole of the Metropolitan Police working with many other forces and other partners recapture Khalif, the suspected terrorist who was on the run. I think it's interesting to reflect that probably nowhere else in the world do we have a system this joined up where counter-terrorism specialists are working with a far greater number of colleagues in specialist crime and local police officers to bring back in a dangerous and concerning individual. That team effort was exceptionally powerful. Of course, over the last year, we've also had major challenges, two massive state occasions of a scale not seen for decades, and as I've said before, the policing the coronation was a uniquely challenging operation, which my team, supported by officers from around the country, did a fantastic job on. And we've also seen the sort of Casey report. We've seen other challenges. We've developed a new reform plan, and we've been developing the strongest doubling down on police standards in history. But in terms of where we're trying to get to, I was struck last week. We were talking publicly about some work we're doing where we're targeting our resources towards the highest crime neighbourhoods in London to bring around transformational change. It's part of what's called the clear, hold, build strategy, where you clear the ground of the organised crime that's driving criminality. You hold the ground working with local authorities so that they and communities can work together to create a safer area. And one of the residents, when was asked by a journalist, what's it like living in this area now? And this young woman said, for the first time, I can now let my kids play outside. That's massively powerful, isn't it? That's much more powerful than any statistic I could quote to you. So, reform. We've set a mission of more trust, less crime and high standards. That's what we're going to deliver on my watch. 3 parts to that reform. Community crime fighting. rebuilding community policing to strengthen the bonds with communities to better understand and jointly tackle local crime. Culture change. Embedding the values of policing by consent to support the strong culture of the tens of thousands of great men and women I lead, whilst at the same time taking on the hundreds who've corrupted our integrity and delivering the biggest doubling down on standards in 50 years. And third, fixing our foundations, setting up our people to succeed, deploying them better, giving them better training, tools, equipment and technology, bringing precision to our community crime fighting. It's a detailed plan, but as I say, it's boiled down to those 6 words of ambition: more trust, less crime and high standards. Today I'm going to start off though focusing on the crime element of that. Focus on talking about less crime, what Londoners want to see and what we've been making progress on. At the forefront of our approach is building the strongest neighbourhood policing we've ever seen in London. That's a big journey from where we are today. But we know that officers based in communities with a strong relationship with the people they serve have a far better effect on preventing crime as the foundations of our policing. And over the years, as we've been asked to do more with less, sadly those roles, those functions furthest from Scotland Yard have been hardest hit. That's wrong, and that's why I'm determined that neighbourhood and community policing will be at the core of everything we do, and everything else will be built on that. We also need officers empowered with better access to technology. We're starting to use data modelling to identify the most harmful predatory offenders in London, those men who pose the greatest threat to women and girls. And in doing that, we're bringing all the specialist resources of the Met to bear on them, just like we do with counter-terrorism offenders and gangs offenders. We're using phone data analysis techniques that has been very effective against county lines dealers to build cases against the stalkers who target women and children. And we've also shown recently live facial recognition is massively effective at picking out wanted offenders from crowds of people. But the next step I think is more exciting. The potential of retroactively using facial recognition to identify unknown suspects from CCTV images is showing immense potential. The results that we're getting are beyond what I expected, and I think are going to transform investigative work, potentially in the way that DNA transformed investigative work 30 years ago. Quarter by quarter, we're seeing progress. We've seen reductions in shootings, domestic murders, residential burglaries, and calls for antisocial behaviour. We're maintaining homicides rates below pre-pandemic levels, on a par with many European neighbours, and comparing favourably to North American cities. I mean, for example, Toronto's murder rate is more than twice ours, and New York is 3.5 times more. There's always more to do, but London is a fundamentally safe city. Detection rates are up in rapes and stalking cases, so rape prosecutions are up by more than 60% in the last year, and we've gone from being in the bottom quarter of forces in the country to solving rapes to being in the top quarter. We are determined to transform our approach to protecting women and children, as I said, from predatory men. The work we've done on stalking, more stalking protection orders, more prosecutions, is producing an interesting correlation as the tragedies of domestic homicides are reducing. It's too early to call success or a direct causal link, but the results are really promising. There's always more to do, but I'm really pleased with the progress. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this series of events over the next few months with think tanks was I think our determination for reform, and much is in our hands, needs to be matched and assisted by others. We spend less per capita on policing than many other Western countries, and indeed I have 28% less to spend on policing London in real terms per capita than we had a decade ago. We've also stretched ourselves. We've stretched ourselves from policing that 30 years ago focused simply on the public space to one that increasingly and rightly invests in tackling those predatory crimes that often take place in private, such as I've mentioned, like sort of rape and child abuse and domestic abuse. And And of course, we're struggling to cover the ground presented by the online threats of fraud. So the mission has widened across 3 areas. Success in such a landscape with constrained resources requires real precision. That's the reason we're using data, is for that precision to have the maximum effect with the minimum resource. But we also need precision from policymakers. And sadly, I think for a couple of decades, policymakers, i.e. regulators, politicians, civil servants and police chiefs, have got it wrong. We need to let the police police. For me, this is about mission creep, bureaucracy and oversight that dispirits the tens of thousands of dedicated officers we have working in London and across the UK. Let me give you some examples. First, officers' experience of the blurred policing mission. A number of pieces of academic research show how officers' own perception of the role of policing changes massively after they join. When surveyed just before joining or very early in their career, they unsurprisingly see the majority of their role being about tackling crime, making arrests, giving evidence. They see that as their core role. Very quickly that changes. In one study, officers after 4 years service were asked about their role, and just 9% of their responses related to crime. 9%. In contrast, 85% related to safeguarding vulnerable people. Previous research of the College of Policing mirrors these findings, showing that non-crime related incidents account for 80% of calls into the police. You can see the conflict here. When less crime is what we're striving for, we need to eliminate the things that are getting in the way of officers, diverting them from fighting crime and delivering on that mission that we've set. That's one of the reasons I'm drawing a line at the end of a decade of debate in terms of our involvement in mental health work, which has gone too far. It's potentially as much as 40% of our work. Police officers being relied upon to deal with incidents that should be rightly be the responsibility of healthcare professionals, both for the benefit of the person in mental health crisis, as well as so that police officers can focus on what we're best at. Our new arrangements go live on the 1st of November. Met officers will only attend mental health calls if that person is presenting a real risk to others. This will free up officers' time for some of these genuine priorities. Hence, we need to let the police police. Secondly, bureaucracy. One example. By some measures, it now takes 5 times more work to get a case to court for the police and CPS as it did 20 years ago. 5 times more work. When I see what's expected of officers, it's so far beyond what I had to do when I was a detective sergeant 30 years ago. The complex legal duties of disclosure and redaction have been pushed to the front end of the system, slowing down justice and creating nugatory work for officers. In other jurisdictions, prosecutors do most of this work, the work that we expect police officers to do, and it's done post-charge. It's no surprise that if you make a system more costly and bureaucratic, it will achieve less. That's why we have fewer cases solved and successfully prosecuted than we did sort of over past decades. Criminal justice reform is overdue, and the effect of that will be to let the police police. My third point on this is about dispiriting oversight. I've been clearer than anybody else that police officers must be held to the highest standards of behaviour, higher than people in other professions. We're given special powers and we're trusted to act to protect the most vulnerable, and we need to be robust in protecting our integrity. That's why we're doing the biggest doubling down on standards seen in years. But the tens of thousands of good officers, we want them to act with confidence when they face dangerous and determined criminals. Sadly, we have a system of oversight and scrutiny and policy that discourages that. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's think about pursuits. Imagine a case where officers are pursuing a suspect in a fleeing vehicle. The officer's trained for pursuits. He or she causes no accident, causes no injury, but the suspect crashes, causing serious injury to himself or perhaps another. Under the current system, those officers would often be investigated, often for many months, effectively holding them to account for somebody else's poor decision making. I think you'd be hard pushed to find anywhere in the world where police officers get investigated for safely pursuing criminals. Why should it happen in Britain? Why should we discourage officers from pursuing offenders? A second example of this, deaths. Sadly, crime is often committed by the ill and the vulnerable. Any concern about the health of an arrestee will lead to a medical professional, often at a hospital, being asked to check them out, give them any necessary treatment before they're taken to custody. And it's only at that stage, when we're satisfied that someone's fit to be in custody, that they're held there. Sadly, on occasion, individuals in such circumstances die because their symptoms have been missed by the medical professionals. What happens then is a massive investigation lands on the police officers overseeing that case, scrutinising their efforts when the symptoms were missed by a medical professional. I'm not criticising them, but if it's not visible to them, how can it be visible to a police officer? Take use of force too. The IOPC and CPS, in my view, fail to follow the same charging standards for police officers as they do for the wider public, dragging innocent officers through years of stress. Some background. Conventional cases taken on by the CPS, everything from shoplifting through to murder, have a national conviction rate of 80%. It seems to me they apply a different threshold for officers. Our recent analysis, for example, suggests that when officers have charges recommended against them for pursuits and cases go for dangerous driving, cases go to court for dangerous driving, officers are only convicted less than 30% of the time. So a national charging standard which tends to achieve 80% based on a policy of a realistic prospect of conviction is being ignored, and officers are being prosecuted on so many occasions when that's not borne out, and jurors find the cases unproven. So of course, I recognise there's a tension here. I'm coming down so hard on those officers who corrupted our integrity, the hundreds that shouldn't be in the organisation. But we need to empower and enable the tens of thousands of great officers with an oversight system which in future needs to act much more clearly without fear or favour, not getting blown around on winds of opinion, so that officers know they'll have the right support if they're taking on dangerous people on behalf of the public. Dispiriting oversight, unfair oversight creates hesitance in their minds, and that undermines our ability to confront dangerous criminals. So as I say, let the police police. So we're determined to reform. I've indicated some ways that we're making some progress. There's a lot of ground to cover. I don't pretend otherwise. A lot of that sits in our gift, and it's for us to sort that out. But just as we need to reform, we need others to help us on that journey, because we need the policy and thinking about policing to be as sharp and precise as you'd expect the execution to be. And in particular, we need precise policy that helps us sharpen that blurred mission, cut the burgeoning bureaucracy, and ensure balanced oversight that's as good as supporting those confronting dangerous offenders as it is at dealing with those who shouldn't be wearing uniform. In short, we need policy that lets the police police. Thank you.
That's Mark, thank you very much. And I think we couldn't get a clearer message. I want to test some of that message. I should first of all say that this is a great pleasure. They're slightly disconcerting for me. I have my own version of the police getting younger, old saw. As a reporter in 1980, I interviewed Sir David McNee, who was at that point twice my age, and told me so. And cheeky little fellow. Followed by annual interviews, because I then worked for London Weekend Television, with Kenneth Newman, Peter Imbert, Paul Condon, John Stevens, also Ian Blair, separately and in a different guise. I had a great deal to do with Paul Stevenson and Cressida Dick as chair of the London Assembly. So I've seen pretty much the whole sweep of the last 4 decades, and I now find myself being taxed by a young man who is taking on what I always myself said is probably one of the 3 least desirable jobs in public service. I occupied one of them myself, and I just say this because I think there's some similarities here. When I was the chair of the EHRC, I realised after 6 years that the task I was charged with was one that couldn't actually ever be fulfilled. Inequality will be with us. We could make things better. Similarly, crime. And the other thing that I discovered about that role is that everybody that you met anywhere knew better than you how to do the job. And I suspect, Sir Mark, you find that a great deal. Now, it's a year since you've donned it. You're not a MetLifer, unlike most of the others that I've spoken to. And in fact, you had left the job. You're a year on. You said a bit about this, but just tell us, what, looking back now, are the things that have surprised you? And do you think, well, let's start with that. What are the things that surprised you this year?
I think I came with my, it sounds a dangerous thing to say, I came in with my eyes open, and so most of the challenges I was expecting. I think probably the biggest surprise, one of the biggest surprises links to my message here about how, for frontline officers, they've joined to do a really difficult job. Frontline staff the same, and those in operational roles, they've got a strong vocation. They've joined a profession because they think it's going to be interesting and it's going to be worthwhile. They can make a difference, and they don't always feel set up to win, and that upsets me. And that's what we've got to fix. Now, some of that is how the Met is run, and some of that's on me and how we use organised resources and equip people. And we shouldn't be buying everyone the cheapest uniform. So when it's 3 o'clock in the morning and it's raining and it's February and they're on a crime scene cordon, then they shouldn't be cold and wet. Those are basics all the way through to the right equipment. So they don't feel set up to succeed in terms of those issues, which is partly down to me. But they don't feel set up to succeed by the wider system, which is why I'm making this speech. And I knew that was a factor, but the strength of that, I think, is beyond what I realised. And I think the intensity of expectation changing over the last 3 decades, the way that mission's widened from just public space to this ever-increasing amount of dealing with predatory men who prey on women and children, and now the online space, trying to stretch that way and not setting those frontline officers up, that really hurts. And they've got such a sense of vocation, they care so much. That's why that's my biggest issue for succeeding, and that's why to use that point in the speech today.
The central point you've made this morning is essentially give us resources and autonomy so we can do the job you ask us to do. But you yourself have just said, that you haven't used these words, but I think this is the burden of your point, that the people of London, and indeed people of the country, because you have this national role as well, should trust you that if you are given the autonomy and the resources, you will do the job. Here's the problem. Unless and until the public is convinced of that fact, that you will do the job, why should they give you autonomy and resources? For example, a police force where we're not absolutely sure that people respect women or that people respect minorities. A police force where actually when we call, your people don't necessarily turn up, or certainly don't turn up in a timely fashion. Though I should, by the way, say, when Policy Exchange was attacked by demonstrators recently, your guys turned up in 7 minutes. Fantastic. If only everybody could say that. The first point is, if you want people to trust, are there things that you need to do before that can happen?
So I would say in parallel. So it's on the trust point, it's depressing to be a commissioner who has to put standards on the top line. So I talked about more trust, less crime, high standards. In policing, standards ought to be sorted, so it's in the background. Integrity is well protected and well nurtured. Clearly, that's not been the case. It's on the top line to do exactly that point, to prove that we're serious about it. And as I've said, there's going to be many cases. There have been, and there will continue to be many cases as we confront those issues. So we have to do that to persuade people of that. I'm not asking for sort of some, I know, independence and no oversight. That's not where I am at all. I expect lots of scrutiny. There should be high expectations in terms of transparency. But actually, what I'm saying is there's a shift in criminal justice approaches and policy, which has made it harder for the police to do their job, and we haven't actually called that out. I'm being sort of absolutely clear. We're going to be sort of sacking and prosecuting more officers because we've got hundreds of people who shouldn't be there. But when you're the only jurisdiction I can find in the world where an officer's blamed for what a suspect they're pursuing does, that can't make sense. So I think there's a balance here. You need to be persuaded. The public need to be persuaded. Need to see and believe that we are serious about reform and are sorting out the things we can do. And part of that goes to that transparency and that reporting and events like this and the new policing board the mayor's going to be holding in public and all of those factors. But actually, if there are things that I can't fix, then we need help on that as well. So if we all want policing to win, that's all I'm asking for.
Well, let's deal with some of the concrete issues. There's a lot of reporting in papers today, actually, about the public realm, particularly shoplifting, and my former colleague Sharon White has talked about that, written about the High Street. She's talked really more about this public estate, but also the impact of low-level crime, antisocial behaviour, and so on. Now, what you said this morning and what you've been saying, previously, is the issue is to do with the issue of being able to provide community policing and so on. By our reckoning, you're about 1,500 officers short. You are probably down. I think from your own reports, you're down on ward-based policing by 4 or 5%. How are you going to be able to deal with those kinds of things that really do affect people, which people see on a day-to-day basis? If you can't do that, again, coming back to this issue of trust, the big issues, fine, but the public doesn't see that. What they see is that something's happened in Sainsbury's, nobody's turned up, and they're getting away with it again.
Very fair question, and that's why I made the point earlier on about 80% of police calls being not crime related, about the experience of officers on what they get drawn into dealing with, because what's behind that, there's a whole range of reports over many decades, changes in policies where policing has been criticised for not dealing with those issues and has slowly stepped towards those, and what that leaves is the core role of crime not being dealt with well. Hence the point I made earlier about mental health, but there are many other examples. So the reason we've got to be vigorous about making the mission about crime, some of which I can do, some of which we need help with, the reason we need to do that is if we don't do that, we can't be as effective on exactly those issues you're talking about. Doing it with a community-based approach is the right approach. We will put more resources into it, but it's going to be a struggle for them to the effect they need if we don't have the policy that wraps around it.
All right. Well, let me ask you about one other thing, where perhaps this is in your hands, where you could send a big fat signal to the public. Now, we're reading that Home Secretary has been writing to senior police officers about, let's summarise it as wokeism, and that there's going to be some pushback from the Police Superintendents Association. Why are we making a massive fuss about this? But I think, is there not some legitimacy when people say, we can see on a telly that police officers now know how to dance the Macarena, but they literally can't find a way of collaring a burglar. Now, you're coming off a good weekend for you, but isn't there at least one way in which you can be clear on which side of that particular argument you stand, because you're very vulnerable to the sense that your priorities are just wrong?
So I've been absolutely clear. I don't sort of use words like woke and anti-woke. I don't think it's helpful. But we operate without fear or favour. We don't dance with protesters.
That's off the menu for the Met officers.
That's absolutely. We don't dance with protesters.
No taking the knee.
Whether a cause has 95% public support or 5% public support, it's wrong for a police officer to align themselves to it. Full stop. End of story. I think that's slightly different to meeting communities to understand what's troubling them and fixing it. So I think and I think sometimes it gets presented as, oh, you shouldn't be talking to communities, which I think is ridiculous. But in terms of aligning to causes, absolutely, that's not our business.
Let's talk about this issue, the interesting point you've raised about pursuit. Yeah. And again, once again, it does come down to an issue of trust and confidence, doesn't it? That there is what you might regard as burdensome oversight, but on the other hand, from the other side of the picture, this might be regarded as a necessary corrective to failures of the past. And this is not at all an accusation of you, because you've been here just a year, but is part of your problem as the Met Commissioner today that before you can get the public to trust you have to correct for many of the failures of the past. The officers who exchange WhatsApp messages that in any organisation would be unacceptable, and so on.
So I think both things can be true alongside each other. I don't think there's a sequencing issue here. So firstly, in terms of the issues of integrity, I've been really clear on. We published some data a few months ago in terms of the amount to which we'd stepped up our doubling down on standards, the growth in investigations, the growth of reports from colleagues, because the good majority of the Met want this stuff sorted out, and the progress we're making. And there'll be a London Policing Board with the Mayor soon where we'll be putting more data out there which will show the scale of the progress we're making, and also illustrate blockages in the system which the government changing the regulations as they've announced is going to help. So we are doing that, and of course you're right, people need to see that and believe it, and I don't dispute that. But I think it's a different question to say, do we really want to hold a police officer to account if a criminal they're chasing does something stupid? When did that ever become sensible? I don't think there's any other jurisdiction that thinks that. That's not about police officers' integrity. That's about saying, do we want police officers to feel free to chase criminals as long as the officer's doing it safely himself or herself? Surely that's just obvious, but we've ended up with a system which says, well, if it goes right, if the criminal does something stupid, a whole set of investigations are going to fall over you, and that seems wrong to me. I'd be interested in what people think when we get to the questions.
We'll come to that in a moment. One of the first things that you said when you arrived, which I think did cut through pretty widely, was that you thought that whilst the majority, or the overwhelming majority of people who work for you are in the right place, want to do the right thing, the culture of the Metropolitan Police was infected by a minority of people who were more than bad apples. They made the culture and the standard and the norms wrong, and that your answer was not gradualism, but to take them out.
Yeah.
What can you say now, after a year, about the extent of the problem? Because when you first came, you talked about maybe 100 you didn't know. Are you still convinced that there are hundreds, or maybe more? What's the scale of the problem?
I'm still convinced it's hundreds. As I say, I'm going to publish some data in a couple of weeks' time, which is going to show the progress made on that. I think the important thing to stress here is that you can have a majority of an organisation who are good people, but systemically you can fail and have failed to root out those who shouldn't be there, to set the standards and the culture. So that's what we have to change. We have to both remove cut the cancer out of the organisation, as well as strengthen the culture of the rest, so that the good officers feel more able to challenge and get the support they're looking for, and those issues. So I can see we're making progress. Lifting the stone is always painful because you find things underneath it that you didn't expect, and it also exposes that some of the system changes that we need aren't in our gift. So It's helpful that government's listened and it sort of announced a couple of weeks ago they're changing the regulations. So just to give you one simple example of how that responsibility stretches beyond us. Police officers are not employed under normal employment law in most respects. There's something called police regulations, which not necessarily everyone will realise. There is no explicit provision in police regulations that if a police officer fails a re-vetting, that there's a route to dismiss them. So, which is clearly completely perverse. We've been trying to find ways to use these regulations to do it, but the government are now about to change that, hopefully in the new year, which will make that more straightforward. Now, it's blindingly obvious that if an officer is no longer fit to pass their vetting, that they should leave the organisation, and yet there hasn't been a provision to enable that. So across the country, there are many cases where these issues have been wrestled with. So the system change is a lot about leadership and culture, and it's about other factors as well. We will determinedly take that on. But I'm here asking for that help in terms of, as I do that, and people will be sceptical until they see the evidence. I completely accept your point, Trevor. But at the same time, if you accept, and I think the vast majority of people do, that most police officers are decent people and try and do a difficult job, we do need to think about how we set them up to succeed. We think about how we let the police police.
Okay. Right at the very end of the session, I'm going to come to our audience now, but at the very end of the session, I'm going to come back and ask you, Mark, what might be called the Ronald Reagan question, which is, why should Londoners feel any better or safer now than they did when you turned up? So I'm just giving you warning, okay. So you've got an answer to that, because I think that's quite a hard one. You've just said that Suella Braverman can do one thing, which is give you the capacity to get rid of cops who failed their vetting. Is there anything that you want from City Hall, from the Mayor?
From both the Home Secretary and the Mayor, the sort of funding issue is absolutely critical. The Mayor can also help with building the confidence of Londoners through his scrutiny and oversight that we're changing and the majority of our people are good, and he can think about, he can use his leverage to help bring partners across London to help us on issues like the mental health issue.
You don't have to answer this, but I'm hearing in the back half of that answer message to City Hall, which is a bit less carping and a bit more encouragement.
I didn't say that.
Fine. I think we know what we're talking about here. Let's see, who has a question for the Commissioner? And I need your name and your organisation. Gentleman in the middle here.
Jeremy Mayhew. I suppose in this...
Could you repeat? Couldn't hear.
Is this on?
It is now.
Yeah. Okay. Jeremy Mayhew. I suppose in this context, ex-non-exec on MOPAC and ex-board member of BTPA. I'm hugely sympathetic with your ambitions and objectives, but there were a couple of things, one of which Trevor referred to in one of his questions, which seemed to me to be either missing or even slightly naive. One, in asking for the removal of bureaucracy, etc., etc., I think you need to have a stronger accountability piece. I know you said you accept that, but I think that needs to be part of the package. And if your package is seen to be an escape from public accountability, Mark, you and I know each other well,
yeah.
But my advice would be that you need to strengthen that piece.
Okay, Jeremy,
can I make
that's your point, but we'll make a point quickly, because there are other people who want to come in.
My instinct is that there will always be some bad apples, probably in most organisations, and in particularly in an organisation which has the powers that you have. And therefore I think you should be acknowledging, perhaps more explicitly, that is likely to be a continuing issue rather than that you can get rid of it.
Okay.
So a couple of quick. So on the second point, absolutely no organisation of 45,000 people is going to be perfect. The thing we're not forgiven for at the moment is that we haven't been ruthless and determined as getting as close to that as we possibly can, whilst recognising it can't be done. So that's what we have to. That's what we have to deliver. Oversight. I think it's a shame that neither Boris Johnson as mayor nor Sadiq as mayor have had a vigorous public accountability means of discharging their oversight over the last decade. Most of the meetings have been done in private. That's now changing on the back of the case report to a quarterly London Policing Board and sub-boards that are going to be public, and that I think makes quite a big difference. There have been one or two meetings like some MOPAC oversight or whatever I wonder if Alex is going to mention, but they haven't been quite the vigour that we need. So I absolutely agree with that.
I'm going to come to Alex in a moment. Lady in the middle. You're going to get...
Thank you. Could you talk about public protest?
Could you just say who you are?
Sorry, Victoria Borick. Could you talk about the public's right to protest versus people's right to get on with their daily lives, and how you think the balance has changed over the last few years?
Thank you. And we could have a whole session just on protest. The law, it's a really tricky area. The law has been grey for a long time. I remember writing to Home Office Minister in about 2013 or 2014 when I was an Assistant Commissioner saying this needs tidying up. The fact the law has been tidied up recently is massively helpful. And I think we've seen with the JSO protests that once the law changed, our response was able to change much more swiftly. And the reason that the way the law changed, it's not for me as a police officer to ask for the law to be... I shouldn't say where the law strikes the balance between the rights of protest and disrupting others. That's a parliamentary responsibility. What I asked for as Commissioner was something that's not vague and fuzzy, something that's clear about where that point is. Parliament decided where that point was, and that enabled us to sort of execute the plans that we did with JSO in the last couple of months, where we were on the scene within a few minutes, but then they were normally off the road within a few minutes as well, because we had the powers to do that. That's constantly our effort. But I mean, protest, there's all sorts of case law that says it's always going to be noisy and disruptive to some degree. It's when that becomes unreasonable in the normal citizen. And I think we've got better legislation now, which has led to that greater enforcement.
Just to be absolutely clear on this, Mark, the issue I think that this arose was over obstruction of the highway.
Yes.
And previously, what our understanding was that there's a line between suspicion and certainty, and that what the police believed was that you had to have the certainty that there would be a conviction before you nick somebody.
No.
Have we? No. But I just want to be absolutely clear that we've now moved to a place where your people believe that they can arrest somebody on suspicion without regard to the certainty of a conviction.
So that's always been the case. That's definitely true. The point about the obstruction of the highway is that there's legislation that talks about unnecessary obstruction of the highway. However, in the context of protest, when the Human Rights Act was created, police officers have to think about the Human Rights Act when they're enforcing obstruction of the highway. So it no longer becomes a sort of binary choice. And that's part of that greyness that was concerning. What the recent change in legislation that Parliament put through has done is to clarify that. So it's never been about the judgment on arrest. It's been about clear law, where frankly I think for a long time Parliament failed to provide clarity, and it's done that now.
Okay, sorry, we're getting quite nerdy here. Former chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Metropolis Police Commissioner. We could spend many days talking about this. I'm going to go. Alex Carlisle, I think I should ask. We've got a few minutes, so I'm going to ask everybody to be brisk, if you wouldn't mind. No, to your left. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm Alex Carlisle. For present purposes, I was the first chair of the London Policing Ethics Panel, and I was disposed of when Boris Johnson ceased to be mayor. You raised a point praising the efforts of the Metropolitan Police about rape, but isn't the reality totally different and goes to the heart of trust? It's a big deal to make a complaint of rape, man or woman, and isn't it still the case that about 95% of rape complaints are not pursued, that over 60% of rape complainants in cases that start to be pursued withdraw because of the complexities of the process and the time it takes, and that it's inexcusable for such cases to take 2.5 years approximately to reach a court? And isn't it high time that all police forces, but particularly yours, and I wish you well very sincerely, got together with the Crown Prosecution Service and the courts to ensure that the existing and competent police RASO process is reproduced to bring these cases in a way that brings these cases to trial quickly and fairly. Because I think I speak confidently when I say to you that young women have very little trust in the police in London at the present time.
So it's clearly an area where we need to be a lot better, but the facts are that in a year we've gone from being in the bottom quarter of forces in the country for solving rapes to being in the top quarter. So that progress happened. But secondly, those numbers are still too low. The whole police service across the country is solving too few rapes because, in part, of this complexity in the criminal justice system. And the slower a system goes, the more risk there is of victims dropping out, which is entirely understandable. There's such an intrusive crime. People want to put it behind them and have the thought, I've got to wait years and I've got to relive it in a court case before I can actually put it behind me. I can't put myself in the position of victims entirely, but I can understand why so many drop out of the process. We need something that goes much more quickly, and that's. I touched on criminal justice issues in terms of bureaucracy, but that whole criminal justice reform agenda is so overdue because victims need to be able to get this behind them as quickly as possible, and we do not at the moment have a system that does that. And part of that is about charging. We need to be able to charge offenders much more early. The temporary arrangements that were put in place for COVID have effectively been sustained, where most cases are bailed for a CPS decision rather than charged at the start, charged at the first opportunity. So I think there's a whole range of factors in this, but you're right, it needs to be better. Your last point about women's trust in policing in London, the ghastly events, not least cases like Carrick and Cousins, of course, have put a severe dent in trust and confidence. But I think it's important not to overstate the impact that's having at the moment. It definitely is in people's minds. We've just done 32 events launching our new London plan in boroughs across London. I've done 14 of them. Questions from women about can I trust you, can I trust you with my daughter as a service absolutely comes up. But domestic violence and rape are still being reported at similar rates they were beforehand. So there's a lot more caution and nervousness, but it's not leading to a withdrawal of engagement with the police. And I think it's important that people know that.
Gentleman right at the back. Been waiting for a while.
Michael Cross. You've concentrated on low-level officers and low-level crime. My question is directed to you and your own conduct. The biggest fraud in this country for the last decade have been the multi-billions stolen through HS2, which we all now know is a failed project. You have consistently, and your predecessors, refused to investigate under pressure from you, the people above. That violates your oath of office. Would you explain why you refuse to investigate the biggest crime in the country?
I think I will just say for what we would call hygiene in television, that is an allegation.
Two general points. One, when we investigate crimes, investigate allegations or not, I have no interest, and I don't say this rudely, but just properly and legally, I have no interest in the views of the Mayor or the Home Secretary or anybody else whether we should investigate a crime or not. That's important to say that. Secondly, any crime, if there is credible evidence, a serious crime will be investigated, full stop.
Okay, Dean, signal to me how much time we've got left, because I think, thank you. Gentleman in front here.
Thank you. Daniel Johnson, editor of The Article. I'm the proud father of a young police officer. He's in a very high crime area in Newham, in East London. And I just wondered whether you could say, how can you give young officers like that the confidence to stay in the force, not to feel that they're being tarred with the same brush of elderly, middle-aged, corrupt officers of our sort of generation, and that give them the sort of inspiration and idealism that they need? So
I constantly talk about the tens of thousands of fantastic men and women we have, and I did that here. Yeah, we've got hundreds to deal with, and I try to balance that narrative. Sometimes, frankly, I know for media and commentators that's not attractive. We're doing everything we can do with our communications to celebrate the good work that the best people did. Like that case study I mentioned in Barnet, where specialist crime and local officers have done an amazing job starting to transform the lives of the community on the estate. So all of those stories are important, and part of it is your son wants to see from me changes to his experience. So, I mean, we haven't changed the world, but we were one of the few forces that hadn't given officers mobile phones so they could work on the move. I bought 29,000 Samsungs. It's a slightly unusual thing to buy. I bought 29,000 Samsungs. We're replacing the cheapest uniform with